Today on Ascend, the Great Books podcast, we are joined by two wonderful guests, Dr. Richard Meloche, the theologian in residence for the Diocese of Tulsa, and Alan Cornett of the Cultural Debris podcast, to discuss one of the best books you could ever read, The Intellectual Life by the French Dominican A.G. Sertillanges. If you want to live a life of the mind, to learn how to cultivate the imagination in pursuit of truth, and to live a disciplined life of beauty and order, then this is the book to read. We share how we came to know this text and how it has provided an infrastructure to our own intellectual pursuits. So join us for a wonderful conversation on The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertillanges. Welcome to Ascend, the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. I'm a husband, father, and serve as the Chancellor and General Counsel for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. We're recording on another beautiful evening here in rural Oklahoma. You can check us out on Twitter or X, YouTube, Facebook, and Patreon, and we appreciate all of our supporters. You can also check out thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have guides and articles and other things to help you understand the great books. And today, we are discussing The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertillanges, a French Dominican. Probably one of the most impactful books that I have ever read in my life. Tonight we have two wonderful guests. Our guest tonight is Alan Cornett, who is the host of the Cultural Debris podcast, which is a wonderful show exploring culture, tradition, and, quote, permanent things. He is also the former assistant to Russell Kirk, the great conservative thinker, and a fan of Wendell Berry. He's also quite known on X for his love of bourbon. Alan, how you doing tonight?
I am doing well. I'm not drinking bourbon tonight, but we'll talk about that in a minute because I wanted to honor our author. But I do host the Cultural Debris podcast, and it comes out all along and should come out more frequently than it does, but I have been very blessed to interview a lot of great guests and more great guests coming up. And I try to talk to people who are interested in traditional ideas and interested in pursuing traditional thought. But like with this podcast, not necessarily political in nature. So those things bleed over, of course, but the fundamentals are the important things. So I am grateful to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful. We're very thankful to have you. Yeah, your podcast is very good. I appreciate it. You did one with Michael Ward on C.S. Lewis, and that one was just excellent. I listened to that multiple times. That was a wonderful podcast.
Well, the great thing about doing podcast episodes is that you line up great guests, and they will make you look good that way. So,
that's good. That's exactly why I invited you tonight. So I look forward to it.
Well, that may be your fatal mistake. I don't know.
So before we move on, we also have another guest, Dr. Richard Meloche, who serves as the theologian in residence for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Tulsa. He works down the hallway from me at the Chancery, a dear friend of mine. He also teaches at the Honors College, a great books program at the University of Tulsa here in Oklahoma. Welcome, Richard. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you guys, if you're not checking us out on YouTube, I have to describe something to you. So Richard has, how many kids do you have? Like 8, 9, 12, something like that? And
yes.
Richard is sitting out.
A
multitude of children. And so Richard is sitting out in the dark on his patio, hiding from his children, trying to engage in this podcast. You have a good kind of murderer aspect going on.
No, you mentioned it was a beautiful night, and it surely is. I mean, you got the full moon rising, and cicadas are humming. It's a glorious time to be outdoors.
I have not once had to edit out cicadas from the background noise, nor have I ever had a guest use the moon as a backlight. So this is going to be a good night. I can just tell this is going to be a good conversation. So, Alan, what are you drinking tonight?
Well, first, I want to point out that I am using a matching glass to yours. This is there we go. That's a Ralph Lauren Safari glass from that I believe dates back to the 1980s circa, and so that they are voluminous. One does not. It would be dangerous to drink a full glass. Although I had thought of doing a Negroni tonight since it's Negroni week, but I decided to go for the French theme. And since our author is French, I pulled out a bottle of Armagnac. So although I may be known and identified with bourbon, the native spirit of Kentucky, my home, I do have a great appreciation for brandies, particularly Armagnac, which is the country cousin of cognac. People are familiar with cognac, but most people don't seem to know Armagnac. But it's a similar brandy. There are some differences which I will not bore you with, but it essentially, the primary difference is that it comes from the Armagnac region of France rather than the Cognac region. So it is a brandy that I recommend and encourage people to enjoy.
That is wonderful. Yeah, just as a side note, so yeah, these glasses that we have. So again, if you're joining us on YouTube, you can look these kind of Ralph Lauren Safari glasses. Just as like a side note, my father recently, passed away a few months ago, and we were going through his things. I particularly asked my mom if we still had these glasses, because I remember them as a kid. Because not only, as you said, are these glasses luminous, but also they're highly textured, and they have this like checker pattern on them. And so I remember as a child touching the glass and being somewhat, intrigued by just how it feels, because it's very different than most glasses. My father, I don't know if I ever remember my father without a glass of Crown Royal. Like, I just don't. And so I remember, like, we had my house growing up was a large house with tile floors, and so I could always tell where my dad was because I heard the shuffling of his feet in the glass, the ice tinkling against the glass, right? And so I remember these glasses very particularly, and they had all broken, is what my mom told me over the years, as they had all broken. And my father really enjoyed them because he had actually gone on safari. He actually had hunted in the Sudan for 30 days. In my house I grew up in is decorated with all kinds of animals from the Sudan. That was something that he did back in the 80s. And so I was explaining this kind of brief history to my wife, who then very graciously and kindly went on wherever she went on the internet and found them, and actually found the original box and bought me a set of 4 in the original box. And I have basically been using them for a nightcap ever since. And so it's just a wonderful little reminder of my father, but they really are a really unique glass.
Well, I will tell you, as someone who has shopped for those myself, that was a generous gift that she procured for you. I will not spoil the amount that she likely spent, but it was, but she clearly appreciates you. So
the best part about my wife is that she's a gift giver, but she has no temperance when it comes to waiting. So she's like, oh, he wants this gift, and I know he wants it. And so my birthday is in December, and so she bought them and hid them as my gift for my birthday gift. And that lasted like 3 days until I was just like upstairs taking care of one of our kids, and all our kids come up with this like, present that's wrapped. And she's like, here you go. And I was like, what's this for? She's like, well, it's your birthday present, but I can't wait. Right. So I'm also the beneficiary of not only her thoughtful gifts, but I like it when she buys them throughout the year because she can't wait. And so I always get them.
That's nice. Well, it's probably a good way for you to get a few bonus gifts.
That's true. Yeah, that doesn't actually count against the real birthday gifts, right? Yeah, no, very good. So tell us a little bit about cultural debris, but you're also doing excursions, right?
Yes, with my colleague Tom Ruby. He and I have, for the past 2 years, been doing excursions primarily to Genoa, Italy. That's sort of our base point. And in fact, at the time of this recording, we are leaving in just a couple of weeks, early October, for another trip. And after week there with guests, we're going to be traveling actually to France to do a little scouting for next year. And next year we're going to be going in March to southern Spain, and then in May to Lyon and Annecy, and then in October back to Italy with Bologna and Genoa. So we do have guests for all of those trips, but we do have spots as well. So if someone out there is itching to go, we would love to have you. What we're trying to do that's different than a lot of trips is that we do very small groups. We cap the size of each week at 6 guests plus Tom and me. And that allows us to get to know each other better, obviously, but we can go places and do things that large groups can't do. We want to be the opposite of the large charter bus groups that get on the bus, ride somewhere, get off for 15 minutes, have a brief lecture, and then they're whisked off to a cafeteria to eat, which is not what you want to do if you're in Italy. No one wants to eat in a cafeteria in Italy. You want to eat real food, drink real wine. We also, with each week, have a light reading list that we give to our guests to go along with the locale, but also provide some foundational readings on culture and architecture. And we use those as the beginning point of discussion at breakfast and dinner and throughout the week to kind of key off on those, to encourage our guests to think a little more deeply about where they are and what they're doing. Obviously, we recognize they're on vacation, so no one is tested or penalized on those readings, but they're there and they're encouraged, and we use them to talk. And most of the guests have really embraced that, so we're happy about that. So we try to do things a little differently than you would have with a lot of tour groups. And obviously, we recognize not everybody is going to want that kind of trip, but we're trying to find the people who do.
No, that's wonderful. That is really distinct, because most of the groups that I'm familiar with, because we have a lot that come from the diocese and pastors and priests and et cetera that are always kind of doing these types of groups. It's always a charter bus, right? It's always one charter bus. That's always how it's capped, right? We're taking 54 people or whatever it is. And so, no, when you said, we don't take as many people, I was thinking, I bet he says like 20, something like that. I was not expecting 6. So, no, that's right. A much more intimate trip. That's really interesting. I think people need to go and check that out.
Yeah,
Richard?
Absolutely. culturaldebrisexcursions.com.
Very good. Richard, how's farm life? Last time you were on the podcast, we talked about, you're raising some sheep, you've got a lot of chickens. I think you even got a cow. How's farm life?
It is messy as always. And adding to the mess is a recent move. So we kind of moved the farm not far, but some hopefully to more fertile land, a little bit of better acreage, better setup. So we're in upheaval in many ways, both the family and the animals. But nothing has been lost. They're all accounted for, both children and beasts. So life is good.
Okay, so let's look at the text. So we are reading or looking at or introducing tonight The Intellectual Life, Its Spirits, Conditions, and Methods by A.G. Sertillanges, a French Dominican. This is a phenomenal book. It's one of the books I recommend the most. It's probably one of the books that impacted my life the most. And what I mean by that is not just simply like it has intellectual concepts that then helped me kind of like structure my own thought, but it actually made me change the way I live my life. It made me change the way that I actually, structure my day. When do I get up? What am I focusing on? How do I read? Things like this. And so a little bit just like brass tacks on this. So who is A.G. Sertillanges? So he's a French Dominican. He's born in 1863, and he died in 1948. He was a professor of moral philosophy. This was first published in 1920. It's had several publications since then, which includes 1946, and then also in 1998, which is the edition that a lot of people have, because that's when the famous Father James Shaw wrote his introduction, a wonderful Jesuit who was very much formed in the great books and intellectual tradition of the church. So just a little bit about like the purpose of the text. Like I said, its title gives it away, but it is to cultivate an intellectual life. It is, as one phrase uses, the management of the mind. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that it's, when you first hear about it, you think like, oh gosh, this is a French Dominican, I bet he's writing to other Dominicans, or I bet he's writing to, academics, or he's writing, to other monks, or whatever it is. And that's certainly there. But I think that, if you say, well, who's his audience? I think who's really on his heart is the everyday Catholic, right? And he really encourages people. We can look at this throughout the text, but he really encourages people that you can have an intellectual life. Like, even if you're a factory worker, like, you can have an intellectual life. And one of the forewords from one of the original texts, I think 1921, actually gives a little bit of like an insight behind the purpose of the text. They say that there's this letter that Thomas Aquinas wrote to one of his brothers, in which the brother had asked him, like, how do you cultivate a life of the mind? Like, how do you have such a great, like, intellectual life? And so Thomas wrote, I believe, these like 16 like precepts that were in this letter. And so the foreword actually talks about that one of the original ideas for the French Dominicans was to write a commentary on these precepts of St. Thomas Aquinas. And somewhere in their discernment on that, they elected to not do a commentary, but to kind of do like a standalone text that would be a little bit more independent, but very Thomistic in nature. And out of that project came the intellectual life, which I think, if you're not familiar with like kind of the French Dominican style, it's incredibly poetic and it's incredibly beautiful. So Alan, how did you, with all that in mind, like, how did you come about this text? Like, how did you decide to read it?
Well, you have a lot to do with that. So I was unfamiliar with the book and saw you on Twitter/X post about it at a different time. And I was intrigued by it and intended to buy it, even did a little online shopping, but hadn't pulled the trigger. And then I was at a thrift store in town, which I go to all along, and I was checking out the books, and lo and behold was this copy, a hardcover copy of The Intellectual Life. And so what are the odds of finding such a book at a thrift store? I would think slim. So I figured the book was clearly meant for me. So I bought it, and then not too long after that, I think I posted about finding it, and then you contacted me about this, and I thought, well, I better start reading it since I have it and I'm supposed to talk about it. So I am glad for your prodding, both in letting me know about the very existence of the book, but also nudging me indirectly to begin my journey through it. So,
no, that's very good. Yeah, it really, in a lot of ways, is a hidden jewel. Like, it's a hidden treasure. It actually used to be somewhat ubiquitous. Like, it used to be actually like mandatory reading for Catholic seminary. So when people were being formed to become priests, this was actually like a mandatory read for them entering to seminary. And then, like a lot of things in the 60s, it kind of just faded away in this kind of like seminal text, right? This kind of cornerstone text that everyone would have recourse to became somewhat forgotten overnight. But as you blame me, I think I'm going to blame Richard. I think that's how this works. And so I was trying to figure out where I came about this text. And Richard and I both went to Ave Maria University. He received his PhD there. I did my master's work there. And I think, we studied under the wonderful and great Father Lamb, Father Matthew Lamb. And I have a memory that he recommended this text, right? That this was something that he highly prized as well. But I don't think I ever picked it up. And I think somewhere upon Richard and I connecting back when he was the provost at St. Gregory's University here in Oklahoma, and I was a board member, Richard and I got together. And I think it was in that moment that he like inspired me that like, hey, you need to pick up this text. Because I remember us bonding over it. And it really was, just kind of like a raw high take it was really what I needed at that moment in a lot of different ways. We can kind of get into why. But Richard, I think you have the most familiarity with the text. Alan blames me, I blame you. So why don't you answer the question of just like, why? Like, why should people read this text?
Yeah. And I blame Father Matthew Lamb for my familiarity with it as well. Yeah, before I launch into an apologia for the text, it was very instrumental in my kind of intellectual formation as well. As a young academic, moving my way through Catholic schools, was completely ignorant of it. Even going through high school, undergrad, grad school, if you are relatively gifted, as Sertillanges will say, with some of the necessary academic capabilities, some of the intellectual faculties that can make you excel, you can kind of easily coast your way through the academy without too much effort. And that was very much the case for me, very lazy in my studies, but sufficiently bright enough to do well. And once I entered into the PhD program, that's another level altogether. And I think Father Lamb realized my slothfulness and my laziness and my academic pursuits. And it was under his guidance. It wasn't really guidance, it's more pressure, informing me that I must take up and read Sertillanges. And at that moment, it really changed the trajectory of my academic life. And it really deepened in a very profound way my love for learning. Growing up as a young man, really involved with athletics, I loved it. And Sertillanges even mentions this, right? Just as an athlete must train his body for his sport, so too must an academic. He calls this activity as, athletes of the mind. It's a wonderful kind of turn of phrase to understand the discipline and the asceticism that is required in order to flourish in this particular pursuit of wisdom and holiness and truth. And so, Father Lamb was very instrumental for me. And again, I think why should someone take and read is because it has that capacity to really change the way you look at the life of the mind, pursuit of truth, the discipline that is required in order to excel. And these habits that are formed as a consequence do many things, but one of the things that it does most profoundly is that it makes you interesting to yourself, right? You're able to carry on conversations about profound things, and you're not a dull person, right? You're not a dullard, but you actually enjoy reading, you enjoy tracking down truth, and then subsequently teaching it. And so we actually, when I was the provost of St. Greg's, this is one of the required readings that we kind of introduced to freshmen, along with Pieper.
What Pieper text did you have them read?
Leisure. Basis of
wonderful.
culture.
And that's another kind of seminal text that will change your life. And I think too, somewhere down the road, Dr. Meloche came and then worked for the Diocese of Tulsa, and part of his work is with the diaconate program. Our diaconate formation program, which I've talked about before on the podcast. So it's somewhat unique because we actually have a great books sequencing that's part of our diaconate formation program, which I really enjoyed. The Holy Father's recent letter on why clerics should read literature in their formation, both ancient and modern, because it gave me, we went from kind of being a weird outlier that had this great book sequencing in our cleric formation to being like overnight what the Holy Father wanted. So I was very happy to receive that. You really never know what you're going to get from Pope Francis, and that was a very pleasant surprise, if you will. But, Dr. Meloche, you also had the guys in Diaconate Formation Program read this as well, which I think tracks really well with its historical use of a lot of young men reading it as they went into seminary. So, Alan, you're kind of a first-time reader of the text. Any kind of just like high-level raw takes, like, has it met your expectations? Like, where are you kind of in your kind of grappling with the text?
It is impressive. I mean, he's certainly hardcore, I guess we'll say. He's not, he has a very, very elevated idea of what the intellectual ought to be. He sees it very much as he talks about it, as a vocation, as a calling. as something that you must discipline yourself for and do whatever is necessary to make it happen. So he's very much, as the good doctor was saying a moment ago, talking about the idea of the athlete of the mind, that he's very much thinking in that kind of discipline terms. So it is a voice, really, in a lot of ways, from a different time, a different way of thinking. He calls himself a man of the 20th century, but I think he's certainly speaking in that Thomistic tradition that goes back much further, of someone who is not simply relying on vastness of intellect, but on sort of discipline to slog your way through it if necessary. That this is sort of a take ground inch by inch kind of mentality that he has, that it's not necessarily brilliance, but it is consistency and focus that's going to win the day. That seems to be his message.
Yeah, I think that's such a key message, because I really, for those listening, I really want to stress that I think when you approach a book like The Intellectual Life, and I realize I've already said this, but I want to echo it again. You think what's going to happen is like, I'm not an academic. What's the first thing he's going to tell me? I need to learn Greek. I need to learn Latin. I have 6 kids. I have a job. I'm supporting a family, etc. I really just want to reiterate, he's writing to you. And he has this, and this is really what struck me. So there's a few things about this book that really struck me when I say it restructured my life. This was one of the things where I realized, because I think you can make excuses for yourself, right? So like when you're reading it, you're like, oh, well, I'm not an academic and I have a real job and, et cetera. Because, even myself, like I work for the church, which, I'm very blessed to do and have a lot of leniences there. But my day job is being an attorney for the church, right? So I do all of our HR and child protection, insurance, and legal. I'm basically just untying knots all day. And it doesn't really lend itself to like, well, I'm just going to have a cup of tea and, read The Intellectual Life or St. Thomas in the afternoon or something like this. And I think that when I first started reading it, I started making excuses for myself, like, oh, I can't, this isn't for me. Like, I have a family. He's a monk. He doesn't have kids. He doesn't want for kids to throw up in the middle of the night and like you have no sleep. So I think that, one of the things that I just really appreciated about this is that it robbed me of that excuse, because he makes it very clear of like, no, are you a factory worker? Like, are you a somewhat isolated worker? Like, you're just trying to make a living for your family? Like, you too can cultivate a life of the mind. And the two things that I think he stresses very highly in this text that impacted me the most is, one, he has an explicit line there. He's like, you don't have 2 hours a day. You can't do this. You don't have 2 hours a day. And like you said, he's at the same time very inviting, like everyone can do this, but also incredibly demanding. And saying, by the way, if you're going to live this intellectual life, like this is what it looks like, and you have to obey these certain demands. You have to even have a certain level of courage and spiritedness to do this. And that one personally really hit me, because what I realized is like I had 2 hours, because I was like, okay, where could I have 2 hours? And I was like, well, I come home and I have my family and I have family dinner and I read to my kids, etc. But then I had like 2 hours of from time of 9 to 11, I'm like watching Netflix or on Facebook or Twitter, etc. I'm not really doing anything. And so I really, what I did this really convicted me, is I restructured my whole day. And I said, okay, I'm going to take those 2 hours that I don't get anything done. And personally, I can't get anything done at night. Like, my brain is spent. I'm done. I'm not going to pick up a book and read it very efficaciously, much less write at 9 o'clock at night. It's not going to happen for me. But if you move those to the morning, you say, well, no, I'm just going to go to bed earlier and then I'll get up at 5. That's what I've been doing for the last several years, probably since, I read this book in 2018. And it has massively transformed my life. So I wake up and, I come in, I start the coffee pot, I go in, I do my prayers, and then I have a cup of coffee, and I'm immediately engaged in whatever I'm doing, whether it's I'm going to write an article, I'm going to write a guide for a great book, I'm going to read a great book, prepare for a podcast. I'm engaged intellectually. And for me, those are the first fruits of the day, and those are the hours of the day that I am most alive, that my mind is most there. And it's hard though, It was hard to transition. I was always a night owl. All throughout college, everything, I was always a night owl. It was very difficult to transition. But once I did it, it was phenomenal. And all of a sudden, then all of a sudden you look at your day and you fit in another 2 hours of productivity in a real deep cultivation and kind of tilling of the soul. But it's not like you gained 2 more hours. You just reorganized your day. And that was one of the parts that I think really historically affected me and has changed the way that I have lived, and really has borne a lot of fruit.
So what, I'll give you a question on this. What, in that time, since you've been restructuring, what personal benefits have you found from having those 2 hours over time? Because obviously, and this is very much in keeping with him, it's something that is going to exponentially build. The first week, you're
Right.
not going to see a lot of you're mostly going to be fighting to stay awake, right?
Correct.
But it's building the habit. But over years, I know you've had to have experienced a lot of benefit from that.
I have. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So, yeah, I kind of mentioned it was twofold. One is how you spend your time. The other one is, what are you reading? And this is something too that he really pushes on you. So if you're really going to look at your life and say, I need to cultivate an intellectual life. I want to manage my mind, intentionally manage my mind, and kind of, not in a hackneyed way, but really seize the day, right? And live each day like I was living my whole life. Do I wake up the way I want to wake up? Do I go to bed the way I want to go to bed? Is this a microcosm of my life overall? And so one of the things that he really stresses is that you only have so much time. And if you only have so much time, you need to read, books that are worth it. You need to read, great books. And I don't know if he uses this term, I can't remember, at least not in the first chapter, but it's reminiscent of Thomas's commentary on the distinction between studiosity, the virtue of studiosity, and the vice of curiosity. And I think this distinction is so lost on us, and that most of the education we know today is actually curiosity. And the distinction that Thomas makes, and Dr. Meloche, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that studiosity is a very intentional and structured learning. Are you actually learning according to the principles that you should be? Are you moving through the subjects as you should, in which is allowing the subjects then and the knowledge and these kind of spheres of knowledge that build upon one another? Or are you curious? And their curiosity is presented as a sin because it's a disordered pursuit of knowledge. Well, I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to read this other book, and I'm going to read this other book. And the only reason you're reading them is because you're interested in them, but they don't actually relate. You're not reading them in order. I'm I'm going to read a whole bunch of stuff about St. Augustine, but I've read no Plato. I have no idea who Plotinus is. I have no idea who any of these people are. Or I'm going to read St. Thomas Aquinas, but I've never even heard of Aristotle. You have this very, what he says, this curiosity is this very kind of sporadic learning, where today, because we're so addicted to screens, we think it's good if we're just looking at a book, right? So I'm proud of myself. We see these people at the end of the year. I read 300 books this year. Okay, well, what does that actually afford you? First off, what kind of books were they? The New York Times bestselling list is on a 5th grade reading level. I don't really care if you read 300 of those. I honestly don't. I would much rather you simply read one great book the whole year and dig into it. And this is actually really, kind of to play my cards here, I think one of the fruits of it is that we're sitting here today. Because what happened is that I said, okay, I'm going to wake up early. I'm going to read. Well, then what do I read? Well, I don't know. Do I start at Aquinas? Do I start at St. Augustine? What do I do? And I realized, in my own formation, that it suffered from curiosity, where I had read things like St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Pope Benedict XVI and et cetera, but I wasn't educated the way they were educated. They're writing, having read all of these great books, all these primary thinkers, and that their writings are the fruit of that. I'm engaging with their fruits without really ever looking at the roots, if that makes sense. And so I said, I'm going back to the beginning. And so I literally said, I'm going to read Plato's Republic, and I'm going to read it for 10 months. I will read one book a month, and I will just read it slowly, and every morning I will get up, and I will do a deep read of this text. I won't care about these things of how many books did you read this year? If the answer is 2, that might be great, depending on what books they are. And so I actually got up, I read Plato's Republic for 10 months on my own, and really cherished it, but then said, you know what? I think there's a lot more in this text I didn't get. So then I started a small group on the exact same text on Plato's Republic and said, hey, would you like to read this with me for 10 months? And actually, Dr. Meloche was part of that group. He had just moved to Tulsa to actually take a job here at the Chancery. A few other people, we had a mix of like PhDs versus people who had never read it before. And I hosted them at my house. I had charcuterie boards, etc., and read one book a month on Plato. And it just came alive, right? I mean, the iron sharpens iron, looking at the truth in pursuit of, this and this culture of friendship. I loved it. And so then I did it with more books and tried to grow. And then eventually I started a Sunday Great Books group at my home. I said, you know what, guys, we're just going to read the great books together. And we're actually going to go before Plato. We're going to start with Homer. And so we're just like we read one book of Homer a week, one book of Homer a week, or one chapter, if you will, which basically ends up being 6 months on the Iliad and 6 months on the Odyssey. And we were reading this, and this was really coming alive. The guys were like, half the group had tried to read Homer before and was like, this is terrible. I'm not going to enjoy this. Please don't make us read Homer. And then like halfway through it, they're like loving it and debating like the merits of Agamemnon and Achilles and like X, Y, and Z and who's your favorite and like, what do you think of Hector? And it was there that then, Adam Minahan, who has a successful podcast, the Catholic Man Show, was like, hey, I think we should take this to, a greater level. I think this could be a podcast. I think you could help others, right? Because we were commenting about how much we enjoyed this group on Twitter, and people were like, oh, I really wish I had a group to read with it. I really wish I had people to dialogue with it. So it's like, well, how could we do this? And then the problem with great books is that no one wants to do a year on Homer, right? They actually want to have a podcast that's typically curiosity. Oh, this week we'll do this, and then we'll do Nietzsche, and then we'll go back and do Camus, and then we'll jump back and do Genesis, and then we'll do Machiavelli, and it's a sporadic. If you listen to them, do you get fruit? Yeah, you get truth, you get form to a certain degree, but you're missing the great conversation. You're missing like a very structured order through your knowledge. And so this is like one of the things that we're trying to do on Ascend is actually move through these authors in a structured way, in a way that I hope that Sertillanges would appreciate, in which we're taking a slow read of them. So that, I read this, I was looking at the date. So I picked this up in 2018. And so, now, looking at it now in 2024, I can see myself as a younger man, reading this and being convicted in my house. And now in 2024, hosting a podcast on the great books. Because, and a lot of people ask me like, well, how do you do this? How are you doing this whole podcast? Plus you have a full-time job and all these other things. Plus you have 5 kids and you have a little hobby farm. How do you do all this stuff? It's because of this book. It's because I structured my day. It's because I don't really spend a lot of time wasting. And I might spend, obviously I'm a human. So yeah, I'll spend 30 minutes or an hour at night, maybe with a glass of scotch and waste it on, arguing with people on X about whatever, like any other good, human does. But at the end of the day, almost every waking hour of my day is structured. And you know what? I love it. I love the intellectual life. I love reading these things. I like bringing it to other people, and I love it. So that's my way too long-winded answer to like, I think this has borne a lot of fruit in my life.
Just kind of teeing off what you said, Deacon. Yeah, Sertillanges is even very clear that it's not enough. Like he warns about that being isolated in your pursuit of the academic life, that it must be done in community. And that community is with others that are in your vicinity, but also the community of the intellectuals in the past and what other people have said about these foundational texts. And to Alan's point, I mean, fruit of ordering your life is really the joy. And Deacon, you mentioned this, right? The pleasure. I mean, we're very familiar as moderns with the pleasures of the flesh, and they're very good and many and multitude, and they're wonderful to partake in proper proportion. But nonetheless, it pales in comparison to the joys of the mind.
Well, maybe we can look at, let's look at the text itself and maybe allow Sertillanges and his wisdom, because he has this very beautiful poetic. I mean, that's another thing that surprised me about the text is that you imagine, I mean, God bless St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa, but it's very somewhat dry, right? It's very unerotic in the best sense of that term. Now, granted, that's not Aquinas overall, because you look at his poetry, you look at his hymns, right? He has a deeply poetic heart, particularly when writing about our Lord. But I kind of expected like, oh, here's a Dominican talking about the intellectual life. Like this is going to be a very dry read. This is going to be an instruction manual. And it is not. It's a deeply poetic, beautiful text. And so maybe let's let Sertillanges kind of, speak for himself. Maybe look at some examples here in just chapter 1. One of the things he starts off with the vocation, and I thought this is really fascinating right off the bat, right? The intellectual life is a vocation. Vocation comes from vocare, to be called, right? Is this something that you're called to cultivate the mind, to have a management of the mind, to be disciplined and be a student of truth? And he says a vocation is not fulfilled by vague reading and a few scattered writings. It requires penetration and continuity and methodical effort so as to attain a fullness of development, which will correspond to the call of the Spirit and to the resources that it has pleased him to bestow upon us.
Yeah, I mean, he is so French in everything he writes. 20th century Frenchman, very flowery. I think you're right to point that out. But yeah,
this really
it's really
goes right to
interesting.
this really goes though to the point of like, this is not curiosity. This is not just like read a bunch, right? And that's what we hear today. Like, oh, we'll just read, read an hour a day or whatever. Like, he is trying to get us to see that there's a very strong intentionality that you should adopt, and not only how you spend your time, but what you spend your time on.
This whole notion of this development and the deepening of the mind, of the intellect. We all have these native faculties, but they nonetheless, they need to be exercised, they need to be deepened. And yeah, as he mentions, they're deepened through these threefold: penetration, continuity, and effort. And he further on, he says, what's of principal importance is the will, which is quite shocking, right? Because he's talking about the benefits and the grandeur of the intellect in opposition to the will, but nonetheless, in the formation of the will, what is most foundational, the formation of the intellect, what is most foundational is the will.
Yeah, I agree. That's on page in this edition, on this red one, that's on page 10. Yeah, it threw me for a loop because again, it's an intellectual life. You think it's going to be contemplating a lot about how you cultivate your intellect, etc. But he actually gives a very full picture of the soul and how the soul overall is devoted to truth. And yeah, he says on page 10, he says, the most valuable thing of all is the will, a deeply rooted will to be somebody, to achieve something. And this is something I guess, for both Dr. Meloche and Alan is like, what is the role of courage in the intellectual life? Like, what is the role of like self-discipline and spiritedness, like in the intellectual life?
Let me throw in a comment about that, because I have that quote jotted down, although for me it's on page 17, so it's completely different. But it's interesting because he earlier praises that you're really better off to be kind of a nobody, to be rejected by society. It's better to be rejected by society so you don't have to worry about all of that. That you don't need to search for fame because those are just frivolous minds who are worried about those sorts of things. But at the same time, he's talking about doing something and being somebody. So there is a sense in which that those sentiments seem to be in tension, I think. But at the same time, I think that he's talking there about doing something and being somebody regardless of what other people think about it. That you may be somebody and you may do something and you may never really get the credit for it, that from the world, perhaps. I mean, there are interesting tensions there, because he also talks about how the life of the mind is a solitary life on the one hand, but also that you're not to be isolated. So I have here circled solitude versus isolation. He has, you have to have solitude to live the intellectual life, but it is essentially an affront to God to be in isolation, because the true Christian scholar has to be part of the great Christian conversation, I guess. There's a sense in which you must be part of community in order to be truly a Christian intellectual. So all of those things were floating around in my mind when we were talking about that. The idea of courage, I think, is being willing to step back to, okay, I'm going to read the Republic. I mean, that's a courageous move in a lot of ways, because you weren't doing this to post your book stack at the end of the year, right? I've got a book, but you were doing it to be disciplined enough for your own mind to get you where you are now. You were laying a foundation stone, and that you were talking about earlier about the idea of being pulled around by curiosity. I mean, I'm horribly guilty of that, because I'm interested in a lot of different things, as I probably most intellectually curious people are. And so you have to sort of rein yourself in, because you're never making progress in a lot of ways that way, or at least not the kind of progress that he's talking about, I think.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comment about the tension between the intellectual life demands solitude, but don't be isolated. I mean, it's hard not to have that juxtaposition jump off the page. But the way he answers it then is really interesting, because where I thought he would pivot is the need for friendship, right? To read these things in groups. And later in the book, he does talk about this more explicitly, which is something that I had a question. I remember the first time I was reading, I was like, is he going to talk about friendship? Is he going to talk about the life of the mind with the other, right? Because this is something that, Plato will talk about, and even our Lord, to a certain degree, that we're social creatures, right? We need the other to help us, right? The beginning of the philosophical life is know thyself. And Plato says that, well, how do you know yourself? You look into the eyes of the beloved, the eyes of the lover, and you see yourself, right? It's a social, communal path, right? We're not actually isolated from each other. And so it's really interesting that he, at that moment, doesn't pivot to friendship, but he pivots more to this understanding that the Christian intellectual can't be separated from history. He can't be separated from the church, if you will, right? He thinks with the mind of the church, with her saints, in this rich tradition. So the intellectual life for the Catholic mind is not one of novelty, right? It's actually not one of creativity. If I remember right, St. Irenaeus, very early in the 100s, was already warning the Catholics against creativity, right? We have received something. We're not here to make something. And he has this quote that I want to read that's in that same section where he talks about don't be an isolated unit, but also don't be isolated, but live in solitude. He says, a true Christian will ever have before his eyes the image of this globe on which the cross is planted, on which needy men wander and suffer, all over which the redeeming blood in numberless streams flows to meet them. It's just like one of these passages that there's points in this book in which he gets so poetic that I have to sit down and think about why he just told me that in the context of what he was saying, if that makes sense. But he's in this moment of you need solitude to think, but don't be isolated. Another strong theme in this first chapter, which he makes it so strong that sometimes I'm uncomfortable with it, is how much he sees the life of the mind at service to the church, in service to others. It's not just that you cultivate your mind, but when you do that, it's a benefit to the body of Christ and to the world around you.
Yes, he has a quote, and I'm looking for it now, because I know I jotted it down, but where he talks about the utilitarian, or not utilitarian, but the usefulness that you have to, that what you're doing is meant to be useful for others. And I have too many notes because I'm not seeing. Oh, every truth is practical. There we go. Mine page 20. I don't know where it is on yours. Every truth is practical, he says. Always work with the idea of some utilization. So I'll pardon my use of the word utilitarian, but utilization there. At the intellectual mind, he says it's not art for art's sake, right? He actually dismisses that idea. It's not art for art's sake, but it is meant to be in service and not just to yourself. And that's part of that idea of not being in isolation, I think.
Yeah, he's also, now he doesn't do this directly in the first chapter, but actually at the very end of the book, in the last chapter, he's talking about the need, what he talks about I'm going to get that quote directly, the harmonious human whole. So often as moderns, even if thinking about, you're interested in cultivating the academic life, you're this isolated Cartesian mind, not wedded to your body and not wedded to community. That's so anti-Catholic, and Sertillanges just hits that note. So fostering and developing one's intellect is integral to human flourishing on so many levels, and it doesn't negate the moral virtues and the other elements of human culture. He goes on so far to say, talking about this idea of friendship and whatnot, we have spoken of life and society, of practical activities. Let us add communion with nature as an important element of human flourishing. Care of one's home, the arts, friendly and informal gatherings, a little poetry, just a little, the practice of speaking, intelligent sport, public demonstrations. I'm thinking here he's thinking about pilgrimages of sorts, right? Of something along those lines. But all these things come together, including the life of the mind, to have this, as he mentioned, this harmonious human whole. And of course, friendship is important. And to your point, Deacon, all those elements cultivate and allow one to maintain steadfastness in the face of adversity. And pursuing the life of the mind, you have to be, as you mentioned, an ascetic to a certain sense. You have to be disciplined in your pursuit of these particular ends.
Yeah, I agree. Just like a few quotes to kind of play out this notion that God needs us, which again, there's like several parts of me that start to hesitate to even say that phrase, but he uses it in a way that I think is really fascinating, in which he basically won't allow you to see the cultivation of your intellect in isolation. That you have to see it in service to the body of Christ and to the salvation of souls and to the glory of God. And so he really kind of lays this on thick that, like, listen, you not cultivating your mind is, maybe to use a more modern parlance, is a lack of stewardship. Like, you have been given this gift, and if you don't cultivate it, if you don't tend this garden to the nth degree, not only are you robbing yourself, but actually you're robbing the community and something that God needs from you, right? So just like two quotes. He says in the red edition, this is page 13, he says, Jesus Christ needs our minds for his work, as on earth he needed his own human mind. Like we are the human mind of God still on earth. He says, too, on the next page, which would be page 15, he says, we must help our God to renew not the buried past and the chronicles of a vanished world, but the eternal face of the earth. This is one thing that really, really struck me in that first chapter of that the intellectual life. I mean, at some point, you kind of push back and wonder, at what point is the intellectual life not just simply a description of a universal vocation that all Christians are supposed to live? And that's one question I have for the book is there anyone who's not called to an intellectual life in their own proportionality? And given his statements in the book and how, like, all of a sudden the intellectual life leads into all these other things that we're supposed to do as Christians, it seems to me that this book is really written for everyone. And even for people of the meanest intellect, that you can cultivate your mind. And, even if you really just spend the rest of your life reading Genesis, and that's something that captures your attention, and you really never make it out of Genesis, like, have you actuated your potential to its full degree, and what fruits will that have for you and those around you, for your family, for your friends, etc.? Like, it's not really about, like, how large is the garden that you've been given, but it's the fact that you've been given a garden and that you need to tend it. And I think that for him here, then, it's everyone. The intellectual vocation is for everyone.
Even go so far as to say, you have been buried in some particular location, and regardless if you don't have access to good friends or great text or have the resources to enjoy bounty of a beautiful library. Regardless, all are called, even the rustican, right? Even the country folk are called to cultivate the intellectual life. And to this kind of good of the building up of the body of Christ, he actually specifically demarcates what those goods are, what the life of the mind is meant to do. And it's quite beautiful. He says, we are to humbly share in perpetuating wisdom among men, in gathering up the inheritances of the ages, formulating the roles of the mind for the present time, in discovering facts and causes, in turning men's wandering eyes towards first causes, and their hearts towards supreme ends. Right? We are all called, in other words, to become philosophers and aid others in becoming philosophers, which kind of begs the question to your point, Deacon, that are we all not therefore called to some degree of the philosophical life?
Well, I think too, maybe I don't know if I can't remember if Sertillanges addresses this, but like something I've been thinking, for those who follow me on X know that a lot of my own spirituality is heavily pulled from Christian Platonism, which basically was the norm until the 1200s. But one of the things I've been thinking about is that, Plato really stresses at the beginning of the philosophical life starts with know thyself. And he talks about this in First Alcibiades, right? That we have to know ourselves. And this is the oracle at Delphi, etc. And the gospel a few weeks ago, our Lord's beginning command to people was that they had to deny themselves. And I think a lot of people might hold those in tension as two different commands. But honestly, to deny yourself presupposes or has an antecedent that you know yourself. That you can't deny yourself if you don't know who you are, right? If you don't actually have a good understanding of who you are, you're not going to be able to crucify yourself. And so I think too, in a lot of ways, the beginning of the philosophical life, the life of the mind, correlates or overlaps or maps onto what our Lord talked about as the beginning of the spiritual life. And I think too, there might be a way here that both of these have become disordered. And what I mean by that is that we tend to see the intellectual life something that's reserved for someone smarter than us, no matter who it is, right? I find myself being humbled all the time on this podcast, right? I have guests on that know far more about Homer or Plato than I do. Even when I think I've really understood a passage, they see something I didn't, right? And you have to have the humility to know that, to receive that, and to understand your ambit and your proportionality.
That reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, my page 16. I'm not exactly sure where it's on yours, but genius is long patience. And he goes on to say, one does not need extraordinary gifts to carry some work through. Average superiority suffices. So my goal now is simply to be superior in a kind of an average way.
Yeah, he doesn't allow you to get out from it, right? In a lot of ways, we think the philosophical life is a life for a few. It's a life for someone who's smarter than I am. But in a lot of ways, we've done the exact same thing with spirituality. If you look at moral formation and theology and how we do theology programs and systematic theology, even for our clerics, spirituality is seen something, it's for the elite. It's for the few. It's not for the many. And it's interesting to me that I don't know if that's actually true, right? That I think that the intellectual life and the spiritual life are open to all. I think this is what our Lord teaches us, right? That know thyself and deny thyself do correspond. And it's not a call, it's not a question of if I am called, but rather that I am called, but just what is my proportionality? What's my capacity to participate in that call? I just don't think there's anything, and I think that Sertillanges understands this very well. He just does not let you escape. I think he thinks the vocation is ubiquitous, and so he just won't let you escape from it.
And the tendency to kind of tie these two together, the eclipsing of the spiritual life and the eclipsing of the intellectual life that has occurred in modernity, and that false eclipsing is the beautiful example for to take Augustine. You'll appreciate this, Deacon. Take Augustine as an example, where as he kind of descends into disorder, then ascends into ordered living, the culmination of that is that mystical union that happens in Ostia with his beloved mother. And notice in the passage how he progresses. And the progression to loving God is through knowing God, and knowing God through various causes, and knowing causes from perceiving the effects. So he moves from the lower knowledge of things upwards until they arrive for a moment and a flash of light with actually penetrating and understanding the triune nature of the Godhead. And I think what Augustine is explaining for us in the narrative and what the church is upholding is the norm, right? We're all to kind of progress in the knowledge and love of God through these various processes, which is a philosophical movement from lower things to higher things, from effects to causes, and ultimately to the supreme cause, which is God himself.
Yeah, I think humility is just really key. It really is, because you think that you've made good efforts, and then every once in a while I bump into someone who they were raised in the great books, they were raised in a household that really understood what education was, and you realize how far beyond they are. They've had a life of the mind since they were a child. But again, I think that part of humility is having a proper understanding of the self, and not falling into a false humility, which tends to be self-deprecating and excuses the self from their vocational duties. And so here I think it really is a call that everyone has to cultivate and manage their mind, to intentionally manage their studies, their thoughts, how they spend their time, etc., and to use that in the pursuit of truth, and to use that pursuit of truth and the fruits of it to benefit those around them. Let me read a quote that I also really appreciated, that really caught my attention. He says on the little red Father James Shaw edition, this is page 5, he says, "Christianized humanity is made up of various personalities, no one of which can refuse to function without impoverishing the group and without depriving the eternal Christ of a part of his kingdom. Christ reigns by unfolding himself in men. Every life of one of his members is a characteristic moment of his duration." I mean, that one, outside just the beauty of it, he's just a wonderful, wonderful writer. The idea that if I fail to cultivate my mind, if I fail to have this ordered pursuit and to use my time well, if I fail to do that, I, am, quote, depriving the eternal Christ of part of his kingdom. And so, of course, I think that, that goes into our understanding that I think this is a universal vocation for different capacities, but it's universal. I think that goes into Alan's comment of, you can't really escape this, right? So even if you have the meanest of capabilities, you still have an intellect. You're still made in the image of God. You have a reason. And how do you use it? And I think that the danger here for a lot of people is to say, well, I'm not smart, or, I'm 50 years old. I can't start now cultivating an intellectual life. And God bless them. We see this in our diaconate program. The average age of our diaconate candidates to enter into holy orders is typically in the late 40s and in their 50s. Sometimes it's different, like with myself, but for the most part, that's our general class. Most of them, very few of them, have ever read Augustine or Aquinas. Very few of them have ever read Homer or Plato. Very few of them have ever really thought speculatively, right? Their education, for all of us, was typically a training. Here's how to do this, act, right? Here's how to be an accountant, or here's how to be a lawyer, or et cetera. It's a training. It's not really an actual formation of the intellect. But even those guys, right? They could despair and say, well, I'm not called to be a deacon. I can't ever do this. I can't cultivate the mind. But, they have the courage to have those struggles. And all of a sudden, 18 months deep, we started a program this year with the Iliad. We started that, and man, there was a lot of why are we reading this? And why does this matter? What does Achilles have anything to do with me being a deacon or whatever? And you gave it, 6 months, and all of a sudden we're having detailed arguments in class about the merits of Achilles and Hector. And what is arete? And what does it mean to be a good man? And what is piety? And how does piety structure the polis and the family life? And I think my point there is like, it's not too late. It's really not too late. Like, for those who are listening, like, don't allow that to be a reason that you deprive our Lord Jesus Christ, our King, of part of his kingdom, right? You have these gifts that you can offer back to him. And I think that Sertillanges is a guide. He's the guide to allow you to start that intellectual journey.
He makes the point, and I would have to look through my notes again, but he makes the point about God has put you where you are. So wherever you are, it's not an accident that you're there. So perhaps we have wasted time, and he talks about looking back to youth and regret and so forth. But that wherever we are now is a place that we can act from. I think he talks about that to some degree in location, but I think it also has to do with time.
Yeah, it's just so easy to walk away, right? It's so easy to say, this is not for me, but it's hard. And this is where I think that courage comes in, right? That spiritedness to say, no, like, I will be disciplined. I'll make the 100 little sacrifices that it takes to start this journey. Sometimes it's difficult because I'm starting it by myself, but like, I can do this. Like, I can cultivate a life of the mind. And I just think, I guess what's on my heart right now is, for those listening, is like, do not allow the thorns to come in and choke that out. Because you have to understand the beauty and the truth that you've come to understand the vocation, that you come to understand that you have a vocation to cultivate your mind. Like that's a gift, that you've come to understand these things. And if you've come to understand them, then don't allow the thorns to come in and choke that out in your life. Just start cultivating this in proportionality to the garden that you've been given. Dr. Meloche, what do you think about, one of the last quotes that really caught my attention in the first chapter was when he's talking about this tenacity, right? This kind of dovetails into our conversation about the will. And so he's talking about this tenacity that you have to have. You have to have this courage, like, you have to be resolute. And he ends it, this is on page 5 in the little red edition. He ends it, page 4. He ends the paragraph saying, we must give ourselves from the heart if truth is to give itself to us. Truth serves only its slaves.
This is a great tension, right? Like most Catholic writers, he's filled with paradoxes, and this is one of those paradoxes. In order to be truly liberated by the pursuit of truth, one has to become a slave to it, which is quite poetic, quite beautiful turn of phrase. But it's also, I think, for anyone who's tried to cultivate the life of the mind, know it to be concrete fact. That you have to have that discipline, you have to have that austerity, you have to have the stick-to-itiveness to actually persevere in hardship, regardless of what life throws at you, in order to grow in this life of the pursuit of wisdom.
I very much agree.
He also makes this kind of wonderful example. Well, again, it's another paradox that's found throughout that in order to begin to cultivate this life of the mind, again, it seems to be clear from the text that all are called, regardless of one's state. He also makes the kind of caveat, it's a lot easier if that tillage happens early on in your life. And so he has the tip of the hat. Yeah, if you have a good formation in the liberal arts early, it makes the cultivation of the life of the mind much easier later on. But nonetheless, those who have started later in life, it's not without hope. But also, do we not need like an example of someone who's actually pursuing ardently and steadfastly with this spiritedness, the life of the mind, in order to see what that looks like, in order to begin to desire it for ourselves? Do we need that example in our own lives in order to begin to train ourselves? This is a question. I think we've all probably experienced this. Again, I referenced Augustine earlier on. It's true for Augustine. Remember, he's living in complete moral decay and disorder. He actually, ventures into the cathedral at Milan. Whom does he see at study but Ambrose? And he's just captivated by this man sitting down in quiet, murmuring the Psalms to himself, and that prompts him. It motivates him to begin to take serious this great gift that he's been given, them this towering intellect and being cultivated in a truly systematic way. But I think that's true for all of us. We need the example of an academic, or not an academic, someone who's actually has given himself over to this discipline in order to see it and desire it.
I agree. I think too, this whole conversation in a lot of ways is analogous to simply converting to the faith as an adult, right? Like that I feel behind. I mean, I'm a convert, and that's what I felt like. I discovered a great jewel, right? I found the pearl of great price. It'd be really weird if I walked away from it because I was like, well, this would have been better if I wouldn't have found it when I was, young. So I'm not even going to pick it up. Like that's a weird thought. But that's not what happened, right? I found Jesus Christ. I found his church, and I fell in love with him, and I fell in love with the Catholic life. And I wanted to, even though I came into it later in life, which is one of the things that Augustine also laments. But then once you do, then you give yourself fully to it. And I think there's something very analogous to that, to what Sertillanges is saying, is that, okay, if you can understand the need and the call, if you can hear the vocare, right, the call to an intellectual life, like you can do this, like you can. It's not too late and it's not too hard.
That's something that I certainly sympathize with. And I came to it even much older than you. And there is this feeling, I remember thinking that I felt like I'm at the, I've found Mount Everest, but I'm at the bottom of it and I don't have time to climb the whole thing, So what do you do? And one can either despair, but there's no point in that, or you can simply begin the climb, and you might get further than you think you will. And you also might find, I think, that your own past, going back to what I was talking about a moment ago, that things aren't accidental. We're not where we are accidentally. That we may bring some things from the past that we don't even fully appreciate that will manifest themselves in our own pursuits of the intellectual life.
I think in a lot of ways, people can surprise themselves. You'll be surprised that if you have a disciplined intellectual life, you devote a little bit to it each day, how much you can accomplish and how much you can grow and bear fruit. There's a priest in the Diocese of Tulsa who I think has a very good intellectual life. He and I used to work very closely with each other on a daily basis. And even in the midst of like the grind of working for the church internally, which is in a lot of ways just simply untying knots, he still cultivated a very deep intellectual life. And I asked him about it, and his advice really mirrored Sertillanges, but he basically said, I get up early. I get up at 4:30. I get up at 5. And his thing was like, I'm just going to read like 10 pages a day. Like that's my goal. I'm going to read 10 pages a day of whatever I'm reading. And that might not seem like a lot, but then like you're knocking out 300-page books a month. If you kind of think about like that reading load, and obviously there's give and take into that, but if you kind of think about that reading load and what you could do in a single year and what you're doing when I don't know if people understand, like if you wake up and read, one of the benefits about it is that, you read and then all of a sudden, like for me, like I'm reading something, I'm reading right now, I'm reading a lot of Plato, and obviously we're going through a year of Homer. And so looking through the Odyssey as well, you read these things and you start wrestling with them. And it's like, okay, well, time to put it down. I got to go, wake up the kids and do other things. It cultivates in you these phantasms, this imagination, and your mind churns on these all day long. It's just like exercising in the morning, right? Like you do that and it puts your body in a certain disposition throughout the entire day, right? You've given yourself a benefit that actually echoes and cascades throughout the entire day. Reading in the morning is very much like that for me, right? You're allowing the imagination to have all of these things then to ruminate on. As you're driving then later in the day, you're doing these things, all of a sudden these things come back to you and you think about them. And this is very much kind of at the heart of the Benedictine, ora et labora, right? To pray and to work. And they do work that won't impede the intellect from thinking about these things, right? So it's a simple type of work. And so that's not for everyone, but you have these simple works throughout the day, no matter what you're doing. And it really, I think, in that moment also allows your spiritual life and your life with God to blossom? Because a lot of people say, well, God never speaks to me. I never feel like God's leading me somewhere. Well, in a lot of ways, it's like God is a fire. And a lot of the questions I have for people, if they tell me that, is like, well, what kindling are you offering? Like, are you sitting there just on social media all day and watching Netflix and then wondering why God never talks to you? Or do you offer the Holy Spirit some type of kindling? Like, are you giving him something that's already in your imagination that you're working on that he can lead you into deeper understandings of, right? Are you ever quiet? And so I think a lot of these things then, as I think we've already kind of noted in this text, all of a sudden the intellectual life becomes like a cornerstone to your entire spiritual life with God and also with neighbor and with the church blossoming and bearing fruit, right? It's not an isolated, atomized event where it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to work the mind and then I have to go work other things. If you work the mind the way that Sertillanges presents, it's a blossoming of the whole soul into beauty, and it's very fecund, and that helps all your relationships in your life. So, Alan, as we look at kind of the first chapter and kind of conversation that we've had today, any kind of final thoughts or kind of like raw takes as a first time reader as you work through this?
Well, I can't let it go without making a Chesterton connection. One of the things that really struck me was his statement, God does not grow old. And I immediately thought of Chesterton's quote from Orthodoxy, where he says, it may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. And so I thought, I doubt that he had read Chesterton. It was an interesting connection. But it's a moving book, and I'm looking forward to finishing it. It is a convicting book, and I think that your listeners who have not yet read it will feel the same.
Yeah, very good. And I would encourage people too that if you are kind of on the fence about it or whatever, I would pick it up and just read the first chapter. Right? It's not very long. It's what is it, like 15, 16 pages and a small book. Just
short.
read the first chapter. It's pretty short because I think in a lot of ways the first chapter is a microcosm of the entire book, and see if it speaks to you and see if this is something. I agree with you. It's a challenging book. It reminds me like when I read, I find it very parallel to St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life, where you're like, you read a paragraph and he's like, well, you should wake up and say 3 Hail Marys and do whatever. And then you're like, wait, do I just keep reading? Do I read the next paragraph, or do I have to start doing what he's telling me to do in this book? Like, how do I engage this text? And I think that the Sertillanges is in a lot of ways a similar way, which is like you're reading this and he's giving you all this advice and you're like, okay, great. Do I just keep reading the book, or do I actually start to try and implement some of the things that he's talking about? But it is challenging. It's very challenging. Dr. Meloche, what do you think? Any final thoughts on this wonderful work?
It's evident that Sertillanges is not just this kind of dispassionate academic who's trying to have other people participate in this kind of way of life, but he actually loves the reader, and he desires the reader's good, and he adamantly believes that the cultivation of the life of the mind is essential to human happiness and human flourishing. So he's very much a pastor. And he communicates that very well in the text itself. So it is very convicting, and it is very convincing. What is interesting, of course, he's writing this early. What do you say? He was published in 1920?
I believe so.
So, there are certain, I would argue, modern impediments that make his presentation and the good of the life that he's presenting much more difficult, perhaps, than for those living in the 1920s or earlier, or shortly thereafter. Right? There's some unique elements that we have to become aware of. To your point, know thyself, know where you are, and what are some of those impediments that make the pursuit of the life of the mind particularly difficult today.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do think so. Yeah, I mean, just like I wonder what he would think about screens, right? We've only kind of become worse in our ability to entertain ourselves to death, and to have a fake education, right? That I think is that curiosity. I think that was something that really convicted me, right? That then even if we pride ourselves on like, well, I read an hour a day, or I'm reading this, or I read so many books, it's like, yes, but are you reading the right ones? Are you reading things that actually cultivate this, right? I mean, but again, what we're offered is always the broad path, and what we should go on is the narrow path. And this is why I think courage, I think something I've come to appreciate recently is the role of courage in the philosophical life. So Dr. Richard Meloche, I deeply appreciate you being here today with us. We appreciate all of your insights as you give us pearls of wisdom from outside on your back porch, hiding from your animals and family.
Thank you very much. It's great seeing you guys.
Alan, we also really appreciate you being here today. I, of course, very much appreciated the glass and your choice to drink. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for coming on and talking about this wonderful, wonderful text that I think can really be a guiding light to many people.
Thank you very much for having me on. It was it was a providential impetus to get me to start diving into the book. So thanks to both of you for the chain that led me to having this copy and reading it. So I look forward to not only finishing it, but perhaps the results to my own life that come as well.
Yeah, no, very good. And remind people where we can find more of your work.
Well, Cultural Debris Podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, usually Apple, Spotify, it's on there. Some of my episodes I'm getting on YouTube. I'm trying to do better with video on that, because I know a lot of people prefer YouTube as an outlet to watch things. Cultural Debris Excursions.com for our trips. And we'll be making 3 trips next year, so we would love to have folks go with us. It will be a unique experience for you to see the old world and talk about permanent things as we do it. So I encourage people to do that. And I am also on X/Twitter, wasting too much time, so people can follow me there.
Yeah, aren't we all? Okay, very good, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us today to talk about The Intellectual Life by A.G. Sertillanges. And so we will then, next episode, continue in our year of Homer in reading the Odyssey. Thank you.